The large concert hall buzzed with excitement as parents, teachers, and music lovers found their seats. Light poured through tall windows, catching dust particles that danced in the air. The smell of polished wood and perfume mixed together as people whispered and flipped through their programs. This was no ordinary day at the Lincoln Center in New York. It was the final round of the International Young Musicians Competition, an event that could change a young pianist's life forever. In the front row sat Dr. Richard Thompson, a man whose opinion mattered more than most. At 62 years old, with silver hair always neatly combed and a collection of bow ties for every occasion, he had taught at Juilliard for over 30 years. Students both feared and respected him. His word could open doors to prestigious music schools or close them just as quickly. Today he wore a dark blue bow tie with tiny white dots and a look of boredom that he didn't try to hide. Another year, another parade of technically correct but soulless performances, he whispered to Mrs. Chen, the competition organizer who sat beside him. She smiled politely but said nothing. Dr. Thompson had grown increasingly hard to please over the years. Some called him brilliant. Others called him a grumpy old man who had forgotten the joy of music. "Who's next?" he asked, glancing down at the program without much interest. "Jiang Wei," Mrs. Chen replied softly. 12 years old from a small village near Beijing. Dr. Thompson raised an eyebrow. "Village? Not from the Beijing Conservatory?" "No," she said. "His application says he mostly learned from online videos. He gets formal lessons once a month when a teacher visits from the city." Dr. Thompson snorted and shook his head. "This should be interesting," he said, though his tone suggested he expected anything but. He had heard countless students from the finest music schools in the world. What could a boy from some remote village possibly bring to Chopin? Behind the thick red curtains backstage, Wei stood alone. He was small for 12, with round glasses too big for his face and a borrowed suit that his mother had tried to adjust the night before in their hotel room. The sleeves still hung past his wrists and he kept pushing them up nervously. This was the first time he had ever left China. The first time he had ever flown on an airplane. The first time he had ever seen such a magnificent piano. The backstage coordinator, a kind woman named Lisa, approached him with a clipboard. "5 minutes, Wei, are you ready?" Wei nodded, though his heart pounded so hard he thought it might break through his chest. He thought about his village thousands of miles away, where everyone had pooled their money to help pay for this trip. His grandfather had sold his prized bicycle. His teacher had called in favors to get him an audition slot. His mother had taken extra sewing work for months. They all believed in him even when he didn't believe in himself. They say Dr. Thompson is very... Wei struggled to find the English word. "Strict?" Lisa offered. "Yes, strict. Very strict." Lisa smiled kindly and patted his shoulder. "Just play like you did in the preliminary round. Play for yourself, not for him." Wei nodded again and pulled out a worn photograph from his pocket. It showed an old upright piano, scratched and weathered, sitting in the corner of a simple room with concrete floors. Next to it stood his grandfather, smiling proudly. That piano had been his grandfather's most precious possession, bought secondhand 40 years ago. It was slightly out of tune, with 3 keys that stuck sometimes, but it was where Wei had fallen in love with music. 2 minutes, Lisa said gently. Wei closed his eyes and began his ritual. He played the piece in his mind, feeling each note, each emotion. In his village, when the electricity went out, which happened often, he would practice on a paper keyboard he had drawn himself. His grandfather would hold a candle so he could see the makeshift keys. "Music isn't just in your fingers," his grandfather always said. "It's in your heart." The stage door opened. We put the photo back in his pocket and walked toward the bright lights. The concert hall was bigger than any building in his village. Hundreds of faces looked at him, but Wei only noticed one. Dr. Thompson in the front row, already writing something on his notepad, not even looking up. The walk to the piano felt endless. Wei's borrowed dress shoes, a bit too large and stuffed with paper at the toes, clicked loudly on the wooden stage. He heard someone cough. Someone else whispered. He reached the gleaming black grand piano, a Steinway worth more than his entire village might earn in a year, and bowed awkwardly. As Wei sat down, he noticed Dr. Thompson check his watch. The American instructor's face showed a mixture of boredom and impatience. He had probably heard hundreds of children play Chopin's Ballet No. 1 in G minor. Why would this performance be any different? Wei adjusted the bench, but his feet still didn't quite reach the pedals comfortably. He would have to stretch. He placed his hands on the cool keys and took a deep breath. In that moment, Wei remembered something his grandfather told him. When you play, tell a story. Not with words, but with feeling. The story Wei wanted to tell was about his village, about his grandfather who believed in him, about the community that had sacrificed for him to be here. It was about the first time he heard Chopin on a crackling radio and felt something stir inside him. It was about dreams that seemed impossible but wouldn't die. Dr. Thompson finally looked up, his pen poised to write what would surely be a brief and dismissive evaluation. The boy looked so small sitting at the massive piano. His ill-fitting suit and awkward demeanor screamed amateur. Thompson had seen this story before. Well-meaning parents or teachers pushing children toward dreams that weren't realistic. Another countryside applicant, he thought to himself. This will be quick. He noticed the boy's fingers were rough, not the pampered hands of most young pianists he encountered. Farm work, perhaps. The child had probably practiced when he should have been helping his family. Thompson felt a twinge of annoyance at whoever had given this boy false hope. The hall grew quiet. Wei took another deep breath, closed his eyes for a moment, and began to play. Dr. Thompson had expected hesitation, a timid approach typical of nervous children. Instead, the first notes rang out with surprising clarity and purpose. The American instructor's pen stopped mid-sentence. Wei's unorthodox fingering immediately caught Thompson's professional eye. Self-taught habits were apparent, things any proper teacher would have corrected years ago. Yet somehow the technical imperfections didn't matter as much as they should have. There was something else happening. Thompson found himself setting down his pen. The boy wasn't just playing notes. He was saying something. The opening melody floated through the hall with a questioning innocence that made several audience members sit up straighter. It was as if the music were asking, "Is there room in this world for me?" Wei's left hand provided a foundation that seemed to come from somewhere ancient and sure. His small body swayed slightly as he built the first dramatic moment of the piece, his eyes now open but seeing something beyond the hall, beyond New York, perhaps beyond this world entirely. Dr. Thompson's initial judgment began to falter. He had expected to hear an approximation of Chopin, the notes more or less correct but the spirit absent. Instead, he was hearing something both faithful to the composer and undeniably personal. It was Chopin interpreted through the experiences of a boy from a world Thompson had never known. As Wei navigated the increasingly complex emotional landscape of the ballade, something shifted in the hall. The coughing stopped. The whispering ceased. Even the usual shuffling of programs fell silent. 200 people collectively held their breath, and among them, most surprised of all, was Dr. Richard Thompson. The boy's technique was unusual, clearly self-developed to overcome the limitations of whatever instrument he had learned on. Yet it worked. Some passages that seasoned pianists found challenging seemed to flow naturally from his small hands, while other typically simpler sections revealed the gaps in his formal training. Wei approached the lyrical middle section, and his whole demeanor softened. His face, previously tight with concentration, relaxed into something like joy. The melody sang out as if the piano were not a percussion instrument at all, but a human voice telling of both sadness and hope. Dr. Thompson felt a familiar prickling at the back of his neck, the same feeling he had experienced decades ago when, as a young man, he had heard Vladimir Horowitz play in this very hall. It was the physical response to witnessing something extraordinary, something rare. As the first part of Wei's performance drew toward its close, building toward the dramatic shift that would come next, Thompson realized he had been wrong. Completely, utterly wrong. This was not going to be quick or forgettable. This was not going to be something he could dismiss with a few scribbled notes. This was going to be one of those performances that reminded him why he had devoted his life to music in the first place. The first section of Wei's performance had captured the attention of everyone in the hall, but what came next would truly test his abilities. The ballade was about to enter its more technically challenging passages, sections that had tripped up pianists 3 times Wei's age and experience. Dr. Thompson leaned forward slightly in his seat. Against his better judgment, he found himself invested in the boy's performance. 30 years of teaching had trained him to spot the moment when a student would reach their technical limit. That moment was coming for Wei, surely. No amount of natural talent could overcome the boy's obvious lack of formal training. Not with Chopin. Not with this piece. He'll falter in the presto section, Thompson thought. They always do. Wei paused briefly, almost imperceptibly, gathering himself. His small shoulders rose and fell with a deep breath. The audience remained perfectly still, as if movement might break whatever spell the young pianist had cast. Then Wei's hands returned to the keys, and the music transformed. The gentle questioning of the earlier section gave way to something more urgent, more insistent. His left hand began a rolling pattern that rippled like water, while his right delivered the melody with growing intensity. In the third row, an older woman closed her eyes, transported by the music. In the balcony, a young music student who had performed earlier that day watched with both envy and admiration. And in the front row, Dr. Thompson's frown deepened, not with disapproval but with concentration. The American instructor had heard this piece butchered by students who played every note correctly, but missed its heart entirely. He had heard it performed flawlessly by professionals who somehow left him cold. What was happening on stage defied his categories. The boy's technique was unpolished, occasionally even awkward, yet the music lived and breathed as if Chopin himself were telling his story through those small, rough hands. Wei's fingers stumbled slightly over a difficult run, and Thompson tensed, waiting for the collapse that usually followed such a mistake. In his experience, young pianists often unraveled after an error, their confidence shattered. But Wei didn't stop or hesitate. He simply absorbed the mistake into the music and continued, the brief imperfection almost becoming part of the piece's emotional landscape. "Remarkable," Thompson whispered, unaware he had spoken aloud until Mrs. Chen glanced at him with surprise. As the piece built toward its first major climax, Wei's body language changed. The nervous boy who had shuffled onto the stage was gone. In his place was a young artist fully immersed in creation. His eyes were open but seeing something beyond the hall. His posture remained humble but had acquired a quiet dignity. When the climax arrived, Wei didn't attack the piano as many young performers did, trying to impress with volume and speed. Instead, he let the moment emerge naturally, as if it were inevitable. The sound filled the hall not because he struck the keys harder, but because he somehow drew more color, more resonance from the instrument. In that moment, Dr. Thompson understood something that had eluded him throughout his distinguished career. Technical perfection, while important, was ultimately just a tool. What mattered was the ability to speak through the music, to make the piano an extension of one's inner voice. This boy, with his limited training and ill-fitting suit, had somehow grasped this truth that many of Thompson's most accomplished students still struggled to understand. As the music transitioned again, flowing into one of the ballade's more lyrical sections, Wei's touch became incredibly delicate. Notes hung in the air like drops of water about to fall. The contrast with the previous intensity made this gentleness all the more powerful. Thompson found himself holding his breath. He had heard this piece hundreds of times, had taught it to dozens of students, yet it felt new to him now. He was not just hearing Chopin's ballade. He was hearing the story of a boy from a village in China, of sacrifices made and distances traveled, of a love for music that had survived against improbable odds. In the audience, a few people wiped away tears. They couldn't have explained exactly why they were moved, only that the music had somehow bypassed their intellect and spoken directly to something deeper. Wei approached another technical hurdle, a series of intricate passages that required precision and control. Thompson tensed again, professional instinct taking over. This section had been the downfall of many promising performances. The boy's left hand began the difficult accompanying pattern, while his right delivered the melodic line. Thompson noticed how Wei had adapted his fingering to accommodate what must have been his smaller practice piano back home. It wasn't how Thompson would have taught it, wasn't how anyone would have taught it, but it worked. The boy had found his own path through the technical maze. Mrs. Chen leaned toward Thompson. "He's never performed on a concert grand before today," she whispered. "Only in the rehearsal this morning." Thompson's eyebrows shot up. This revelation made the performance even more astonishing. Most pianists needed time to adjust to a new instrument, especially when moving from an upright to a 9-foot Steinway. The touch, the pedal response, the tonal possibilities, everything was different. Wei navigated through the difficult passage with concentration etched on his face. There were imperfections, A blurred run here, a slightly uneven trill there. But the music never lost its narrative thread. Each note led purposefully to the next, telling a continuing story. As the music began building toward another, larger climax, Thompson found himself thinking about his own journey as a musician. He had been a promising pianist once before deciding that his talents were better suited to teaching than performing. Over the decades, he had identified and nurtured exceptional talents, sending them off to great careers. It was a life's work he was proud of, but somewhere along the way, something had hardened in him. He had become more focused on finding flaws than recognizing gifts, more interested in technical correctness than emotional truth. When had that happened? When had music become something to judge rather than something to feel? Wei's playing was now approaching the most demanding section of the piece. The tempo increased, the harmonies grew more complex, and the emotional intensity deepened. Many young pianists rushed through this part, letting technical challenges overwhelm musical intent. Others slowed down too much, losing the music's forward momentum. Wei did neither. He maintained a pulse that breathed like a living thing, pushing forward slightly in moments of tension, relaxing almost imperceptibly in moments of release. It was the kind of rubato that couldn't be taught, only felt. Thompson glanced around the hall. Every face reflected the same rapt attention. These were sophisticated listeners, teachers, parents of musicians, music lovers who attended concerts regularly. They knew when they were hearing something special. The music grew more turbulent. Wei's small body swayed with the surging emotions of the piece. His feet stretched to reach the pedals, sometimes barely making it. Yet he never lost control of the piano's resonance. Thompson had a sudden image of the boy practicing in his village, perhaps with books stacked on the pedals of an old upright so his feet could reach them. How many hours had he spent alone with Chopin discovering these sounds, these emotions? How had he understood, with so little guidance, what this music was truly about? As the turbulence reached its peak, Wei's fingers flew across the keys in passages that blurred with speed. There was a wildness to his playing now, but it remained tethered to something deeply authentic. This wasn't technique for technique's sake. It was music pushed to its expressive limits. Then came a moment that Thompson would remember for the rest of his career. In one particularly difficult passage, instead of struggling through it as expected, Wei found a kind of freedom. His hands moved with a sureness that belied his years, his training, everything that should have limited him. In that moment, he wasn't a 12-year-old boy from a remote village. He was simply music itself. The hall seemed to hold its collective breath. Thompson felt a chill run up his spine, the physical response to witnessing something extraordinary. In all his years of teaching, of judging competitions, of attending concerts by the world's greatest pianists, these moments of true musical transcendence were rare. They couldn't be manufactured or forced. They either happened or they didn't, and it was happening now, with this unlikely boy from China. As the music descended from its emotional peak, flowing toward the brief moment of calm before the final push, Thompson realized that his evaluation sheet remained empty. He had been too captivated to write. What could he possibly put on paper that would capture what was happening on that stage? The brief oasis of tranquility in the music allowed both performer and audience a moment to breathe. Wei's touch grew gentle again, the notes like quiet footsteps after a storm. His face showed both exhaustion and exhilaration, the look of someone who has given everything yet somehow found more to give. Thompson knew what was coming next. The coda of the ballade was one of the most demanding conclusions in the piano repertoire, a test of endurance, technique, and musical understanding. After the emotional journey Wei had already delivered, could he possibly have enough left for this final challenge? The American instructor who had looked down so dismissively at the boy just minutes earlier now found himself hoping, actually hoping, that Wei would triumph in these final pages. Not just for the boy's sake, but because Thompson himself needed to hear how this story would end. The brief moment of calm in the music was ending. Wei sat a little straighter on the bench, his shoulders squaring as if preparing for a final challenge. Everyone in the hall could feel it coming, the notorious coda of Chopin's ballade, a whirlwind of notes that had humbled many accomplished pianists. Dr. Thompson unconsciously gripped the armrests of his chair. In his 30 years of teaching, he had seen countless talented students approach this section with technical skill, but emerge with only a mechanical reproduction. The coda demanded everything at once: speed, precision, emotional control, and that rarest quality, courage. The courage to throw oneself fully into the music's final statement without holding anything back. How could this boy, with his limited training and borrowed suit, possibly have enough left to give? Wei's hands hovered above the keys for a split second. In that moment of suspension, Thompson saw something change in the boy's face. A quiet determination that transcended nervousness or showmanship. Then his hands descended and the final battle began. The notes came faster now, cascading like water over rocks, each one distinct yet part of a greater flow. Wei's left hand provided a foundation that remained rock solid despite the increasing complexity. His right delivered figurations that sparkled and blurred with speed but never lost their shape. Thompson leaned forward, his professional eye catching details that might escape even the educated audience. The boy's pinky finger on his right hand, slightly weaker than it should be, probably from lack of proper technical exercises, was nonetheless doing its job. His wrist remained flexible despite the tension that must have been building in his forearms. Most surprisingly, his touch maintained its clarity even as the tempo increased. In the audience, a famous concert pianist who happened to be in New York and had come to scout for talent watched with increasing amazement. He had performed this same piece at Carnegie Hall just 3 months earlier. He knew intimately what it demanded, what it cost, and here was this child, playing with a freedom that made him question his own approach to the music. Wei was fully inside the music now, his body swaying slightly with its rhythmic pull. His feet stretched desperately for the pedals, sometimes barely reaching them, yet he never lost control of the piano's resonance. There was nothing calculated about his performance anymore. He was riding the music like a wave, responding to its demands moment by moment. The hall grew warmer as the collective concentration of hundreds of people focused on the stage. No one coughed. No one shifted in their seats. The usual small noises of a concert audience had disappeared completely. There was only Chopin, speaking through the hands of a 12-year-old boy from a village in China. As the coda built toward its climax, Wei's playing took on an almost orchestral quality. The Steinway, responding to his touch, produced colors and textures that seemed impossible from a single instrument. Bass notes thundered like timpani, middle voices sang like cellos. The highest notes glittered like stars. Dr. Thompson had stopped analyzing. The part of him that was always the teacher, the judge, the critic had fallen silent. He was experiencing the music purely now, as he had when he was young, before knowledge had begun to interfere with feeling. The most technically demanding passage arrived, a series of descending chromatic chords that required perfect coordination between the hands. Many pianists slowed down here, sacrificing momentum for accuracy. Others powered through with pedal, blurring the harmonies into an impressive but muddy effect. Wei did neither. His tempo remained urgent but not frantic. His fingers found each chord with startling precision, giving each its own weight and color. There were no tricks or compromises, just honest musicianship of the highest order. Mrs. Chen glanced sideways at Thompson and was startled by what she saw. The famous instructor, known for his poker face during performances, known for finding flaws in even the most polished playing, had tears in his eyes. The music drove forward relentlessly now. Wei's small body was working hard, his breathing visible, sweat beginning to shine on his forehead under the stage lights. Yet there was no sense of struggle in the music itself. It flowed with an inevitability that made it seem as though it could not have been played any other way. In the balcony, a group of Juilliard students who had come to observe the competition exchanged glances of disbelief. They had spent years with the best teachers, practicing 6 hours a day, analyzing recordings, attending master classes. How was this possible? How could this untrained boy from nowhere understand so intuitively what they had been striving so hard to learn? The answer was in front of them if they could see it. Wei played with the freedom of someone who had discovered music for himself, rather than having it handed to him as a set of rules. His imperfect technique had forced him to find his own solutions. His limited access to instruction had made every bit of guidance precious. Most importantly, his love for the music had remained pure, uncorrupted by competition or career concerns. As the coda approached its final moments, Wei's playing took on an almost desperate intensity. The melody sang out above thundering bass notes and swirling harmonies. It was no longer just Chopin's voice or Wei's voice. It was something universal, something that spoke to everyone in the hall in their own private language. Dr. Thompson found himself holding his breath. He had heard this piece hundreds of times, had taught it to dozens of students, yet it felt new to him now. He was not just hearing Chopin's ballade. He was hearing the story of a boy who had found beauty in a world that offered him little, who had pursued that beauty against all odds. In the penultimate measure, where many pianists begin to pull back, preparing for the final chords, Wei did something extraordinary. He pushed forward slightly, adding an urgency that made the conclusion feel not like an ending imposed by the composer, but a destination arrived at naturally, inevitably. And then came the final chords, massive, definitive statements that seemed to contain all the emotion of the preceding pages. Wei's hands came down with perfect weight, neither too heavy nor too cautious. The sound filled the hall completely. The last chord hung in the air, sustained by the pedal, gradually fading but never quite disappearing, as if the music had left some permanent mark on the atmosphere of the room. For several seconds after the sound had died away, no one moved. No one breathed. The spell that Wei had cast remained unbroken. Then Dr. Thompson rose to his feet. In 30 years of judging competitions, he had never given a standing ovation. He had always remained seated, professional, detached. Even for the most brilliant performances, he had offered nothing more than polite applause. His standing was a statement, a recognition that transcended scores and rankings. Seeing Thompson stand, others in the front row joined him. Then the next row. Then the next. Within seconds, the entire hall was on its feet, erupting in thunderous applause. Wei seemed startled by the response. He had been so deeply inside the music that coming back to the present moment, to the reality of the concert hall and the audience, took a moment of adjustment. He blinked in the stage lights, looking small and vulnerable again. He stood from the piano bench and turned to face the audience. His eyes widened at the sight of hundreds of people standing, applauding, some cheering. He gave an awkward bow, the two long sleeves of his borrowed suit sliding past his wrists. The applause continued, growing louder. Someone shouted, "Bravo!" Others joined in. The Juilliard students in the balcony were applauding with particular vigor, their faces showing both admiration and a kind of happy surrender to what they had just witnessed. Wei bowed again, deeper this time, the way his grandfather had taught him to show proper respect. When he straightened, his eyes met Dr. Thompson's. The American instructor was still standing, still applauding, but it was the look on his face that struck Wei most powerfully. There was no trace of the dismissive skepticism that had been there when Wei first walked on stage. Instead, there was something Wei had seen only rarely in his life. Pure, unguarded respect in that moment. Something shifted for Wei. Until now, music had been a private joy, something he pursued for himself and for his grandfather. He had never really understood why his teacher had insisted he enter this competition, why everyone in his village had sacrificed to send him here. What was the point of playing for strangers in a faraway country? Now he began to understand. Music was a language that crossed all borders. When he spoke through the piano, people heard him, really heard him, in a way that words could never accomplish. For a boy who had always felt invisible in the wider world, this recognition was transformative. The applause showed no signs of diminishing. If anything, it was growing more enthusiastic as the initial shock gave way to genuine appreciation. People turned to their neighbors, shaking their heads in wonder, finding their own amazement reflected in the faces around them. Mrs. Chen leaned toward Dr. Thompson. "In all my years running this competition," she said, though her voice was nearly lost in the applause, "I have never seen a reaction like this." Thompson nodded, not trusting himself to speak. He was experiencing something rare for him, the complete dismantling of his preconceptions. Everything he thought he knew about talent, about pedagogy, about what made a true musician, was being reconsidered in light of what he had just witnessed. We stood on the stage, small but somehow no longer diminished by his surroundings. The enormous Steinway behind him, the grandeur of Lincoln Center, the sophisticated New York audience. None of these things seemed to overshadow him anymore. He had filled this space with something larger than himself, larger even than Chopin. He had filled it with truth, and Dr. Thompson, who had looked down on this young piano player just 15 minutes earlier, now found himself looking up, The applause continued for so long that Wei wasn't sure what to do. He had bowed 3 times already. Should he bow again? Should he leave the stage? No one had prepared him for this kind of response. In competitions back home, applause was polite but brief. This was something entirely different. Finally, Lisa appeared from the wings and gestured for Wei to exit. He bowed one more time and walked off stage, his legs shaky beneath him. The sound of the audience followed him, still clapping, still calling out, even as he disappeared behind the curtain. Backstage was a flurry of activity. The next contestant, a tall boy from Germany, stood frozen with a look of dread on his face. How could anyone follow that performance? Other young pianists who had already played or were still waiting huddled in small groups, whispering and casting glances at Wei as he passed. That was quite something, Lisa said, handing Wei a bottle of water. Her professional calm had cracked slightly, revealing genuine amazement. Wei took the water gratefully. His mouth was dry and he suddenly realized how tired he was. The adrenaline that had carried him through the performance was fading, leaving behind a bone-deep exhaustion. His hands trembled as he unscrewed the cap. Dr. Thompson never stands, one of the other contestants whispered to his teacher, not realizing Wei could hear. Never. Out in the hall, the audience was finally settling down. The applause had reluctantly faded, though people continued to talk excitedly among themselves. Dr. Thompson remained standing for a moment after everyone else had taken their seats, as if he needed that extra time to collect himself. Mrs. Chen touched his sleeve gently. Richard, we need to continue. There are 3 more contestants. Thompson nodded and slowly lowered himself back into his chair. He picked up his pen, looked at his blank evaluation sheet, and then set both back down. What could he possibly write that would capture what had just happened? The German boy walked onto the stage, looking as though he were approaching his own execution. The audience, still buzzing from Wei's performance, barely noticed his entrance. Backstage, Wei found a quiet corner and sat down heavily on a folding chair. He closed his eyes, replaying moments from his performance in his mind. There had been mistakes, notes he had missed, passages where his technique had failed him. His teacher back home would have pointed these out immediately. But somehow none of that seemed to matter now. He took his grandfather's photo from his pocket and looked at it. I wish you could have been here, he whispered in Mandarin. I think you would have been proud. The rest of the competition passed in a blur. We remained backstage, sipping his water, too tired to even change out of his performance clothes. Other contestants came and went. Some played well, others less so. The audience applauded politely for each, but there was nothing like the eruption that had followed Wei's performance. After the final contestant, there was a 30-minute break while the judges deliberated. We used this time to call home on the borrowed phone Lisa had given him. Ma, he said when his mother answered. I played. How did it go? His mother's voice sounded small and far away, but he could hear the anxious hope in it. I think it went well. Wei was not one to boast, and he wasn't sure how to describe what had happened. The people seemed to like it. Of course they did, his mother said firmly. Your grandfather always said you had magic in your hands. Wei smiled at this familiar phrase. His grandfather had started saying it when Wei was just 5 years old, picking out simple tunes by ear on the old upright. The judges are deciding now, Wei said. I'll call again when I know more. After saying goodbye, Wei sat quietly watching the organized chaos of the backstage area. Stagehands moved equipment. Competition officials huddled with clipboards. Contestants and their families waited anxiously for the results. Meanwhile, in a small room off the main hall, the judges' deliberation was unlike any in the competition's history. I think we can agree this isn't much of a discussion, said Mr. Yamamoto, a renowned Japanese piano teacher. The Chinese boy was in another league entirely. The other judges nodded, but Dr. Thompson remained silent, staring at his still blank evaluation sheet. Richard? Mrs. Chen prompted. You're unusually quiet. Thompson looked up, his face troubled. I almost made a terrible mistake today, he said. The other judges exchanged glances. When that boy walked on stage, I had already decided what I would hear. Thompson's voice was quiet, but intense. I looked at his clothes, at his obvious lack of formal training, and I dismissed him before he played a single note. The room fell silent. Thompson rarely shared personal reflections. If I'm being honest, he continued, I've been doing that for years. categorizing students based on where they studied, who their teachers were, what competitions they'd won. I'd been listening for what I expected to hear rather than what was actually being played. Mrs. Chen touched his arm gently. Richard, we all have our biases. What matters is that you recognized Wei's talent when you heard it. Thompson shook his head. No. What matters is how many others I might have missed over the years. How many students have I underestimated or overlooked because they didn't fit my narrow definition of what a pianist should be? Mr. Yamamoto cleared his throat. Perhaps this is a discussion for another time. We have results to announce. Thompson nodded, pulling himself back to the task at hand. Yes, of course. And there's no question about first place. The announcement ceremony was held in the main hall. All the contestants lined up on stage, some looking hopeful, others resigned. We stood at one end. His borrowed suit rumpled from the long day, his hair slightly disheveled. Mrs. Chen approached the microphone. Before we announce the winners, I want to thank all of our contestants. The level of playing this year has been exceptional. The audience applauded politely. Parents beamed at their children on stage. Teachers nodded in satisfaction at their students' hard work. The third-place winner of this year's International Young Musicians Competition is... Mrs. Chen opened an envelope with deliberate slowness. Thomas Keller from Germany. The tall German boy who had followed Wei stepped forward, looking relieved and happy. He accepted his certificate and small trophy with a broad smile. The second-place winner is Aiko Tanaka from Japan. A serious-looking girl in a perfectly pressed dress stepped forward. She bowed formally before accepting her award. The hall grew quiet as everyone waited for the first-place announcement. It seemed a mere formality after what they had witnessed, but tradition demanded the proper suspense. And the first-place winner of this year's International Young Musicians Competition, receiving a full scholarship to our summer academy and a special prize of $10,000, is... Mrs. Chen paused, looking out at the audience with a smile. Zhang Wei from China. The hall erupted once more. The applause was even louder than it had been after Wei's performance, if that was possible. People rose to their feet immediately, cheering and clapping. Wei stepped forward, looking stunned. The scholarship and prize money were far beyond anything he had imagined. $10,000 was more than his entire village earned in a year. As Mrs. Chen handed him the large trophy and envelope containing his certificate, Wei's hands trembled slightly. He bowed deeply, first to Mrs. Chen, then to the judges, and finally to the audience. When he straightened from his final bow, he was surprised to see Dr. Thompson approaching the stage. This wasn't part of the ceremony as it had been explained to him. The famous instructor climbed the steps and walked directly to Wei. Thompson stopped in front of the boy, looking down at him not with the dismissive glance of earlier but with deep respect. Then, to the astonishment of everyone who knew him, the formidable Dr. Thompson bowed to Wei. It wasn't a perfunctory nod. It was a deep, formal bow of the kind a master might give to acknowledge another master. When he straightened, Thompson extended his hand. "Young man," he said, his voice carrying in the suddenly quiet hall, "I have been teaching piano for 30 years. And today you taught me something about music that I had forgotten. For that I thank you." Wei, overwhelmed, took the offered hand. His small hand disappeared inside Thompson's larger one, but the handshake they shared was one of equals. Someone in the audience began to clap again, and within moments the entire hall had joined in. The other contestants, showing remarkable graciousness, applauded as well. Cameras flashed. Competition officials beamed. Mrs. Chen wiped away a tear. But for Wei, the most meaningful moment was still unfolding in the center of the stage. Dr. Thompson had not released his hand. Instead, he leaned down slightly to speak directly to Wei, his words private despite the public setting. "Your grandfather," Thompson said, surprising Wei with the reference. "The one in the photo you keep in your pocket. He was right about you. You do have magic in your hands." Wei's eyes widened. "How did you know about—" Thompson smiled, a genuine warmth replacing his usual stern expression. "I didn't, but I recognize the look of someone playing for someone they love. I had that once too, a long time ago." He released Wei's hand and turned to Mrs. Chen. "With your permission," he said, loud enough for all to hear, "I would like to offer this young man additional private lessons during his time at our summer academy. At no charge, of course." Mrs. Chen, visibly surprised but pleased, nodded immediately. "Of course, Richard. That would be wonderful." Thompson turned back to Wei. "That is, if you would be interested in studying with me. Wei, who had come to New York hoping merely to avoid embarrassment, now found himself being offered personal instruction from one of the most famous piano teachers in the world, the same teacher who had looked down on him just hours earlier. "I would be honored," he said simply, bowing again. As Wei straightened from his bow, he caught sight of Lisa standing in the wings, giving him a thumbs up and a wide smile. Beyond her, through the stage door that led outside, he could see a patch of blue sky, his first glimpse of the New York sky since arriving 2 days ago. In that moment, we realized that his life had changed completely in the span of a single performance. The path ahead of him had suddenly widened beyond anything he could have imagined, and it had all begun with Dr. Thompson looking down on a young piano player. 5 years passed like the turning pages of a book. Wei's village in China had changed little. The same dusty roads, the same small houses clustered together, the same rhythm of life that had existed for generations. But inside the community center, something was different. Where the old upright piano once stood alone, there now was a small but well-equipped music room. A sign on the door read Zhang Wei Music Scholarship in both Chinese and English. Inside, 3 new pianos gleamed under fluorescent lights. Shelves lined with music books covered one wall. A bulletin board displayed photos of children at various competitions, ribbons and certificates pinned proudly beside them. On this particular summer day, the village was busier than usual. Cars and small buses had been arriving since morning, bringing visitors from neighboring towns and even from Beijing. People gathered in small groups talking excitedly. Children ran about in their best clothes, their parents calling after them to be careful not to get dirty before the ceremony. At the center of it all, now 17 years old and considerably taller, stood Wei. He wore a simple but well-tailored dark suit, his hair neatly combed, his posture confident yet humble. Beside him stood his grandfather, back straight despite his 80 years, pride evident in every line of his face. "I still can't believe he's really coming," Wei's grandfather said for perhaps the 10th time that day. Wei smiled. "He promised he would, Grandpa. And Dr. Thompson always keeps his promises." The years had been kind to Wei. After his stunning victory at the International Young Musicians Competition, doors had opened that once seemed permanently closed. The summer academy in New York had led to an invitation to study at the pre-college division of Juilliard, with a full scholarship that included living expenses for both Wei and his mother. It hadn't been easy. Moving to a strange country, learning a new language, adjusting to a completely different way of life, all while pursuing the rigorous study of music at one of the world's most demanding institutions. There had been moments of homesickness so acute that Wei had considered giving up, packing his bags and returning to the familiar comfort of his village. But through it all, 2 constants had sustained him: his love for the piano and the unwavering support of Dr. Richard Thompson. Thompson had kept his word, providing Wei with weekly private lessons throughout that first summer. But what began as a teacher-student relationship quickly evolved into something deeper. Thompson became Wei's mentor, his advocate, and eventually a second father figure. It was Thompson who helped navigate the complexities of Wei's visa status when he was invited to remain in America. Thompson who found the perfect piano for Wei to practice on in his small New York apartment. Thompson who sat in the front row at Wei's first public recital in the city, beaming with more pride than he had ever shown for any student in his long career. And it was Thompson who, after hearing Wei express concern about the children back in his village who loved music, but had no access to proper instruction, helped develop the plan for what would become the Zhang Wei Music Scholarship. Now, 5 years after that fateful competition, Dr. Thompson was coming to Wei's village for the grand opening of the program's new facility. The old community center had been renovated, the single weathered upright piano replaced with proper instruments, and a rotating schedule of qualified teachers arranged to provide weekly lessons. "They're here," someone shouted from the village entrance. A sleek black car had pulled up, followed by a van carrying camera equipment and several journalists. Wei took a deep breath. This moment, bringing his New York world to his Chinese home, felt significant in ways he couldn't fully articulate. From the black car emerged Dr. Thompson, now 67 but still standing tall, his silver hair and collection of bow ties unchanged. Today's tie was deep red with small gold musical notes, a gift from Wei on Thompson's 65th birthday. Behind Thompson came a small group of representatives from Juilliard and several music foundations that had contributed to the scholarship program. But it was Thompson that the villagers were most curious about, this American teacher who had changed their local boy's life. Wei walked forward to greet them. Thompson's face lit up at the sight of his favorite student, and they embraced warmly. "Welcome to my home," Wei said simply. Thompson looked around at the village, the modest houses, the dusty main square, the distant fields where many of the residents still worked as farmers. "So this is where it all began," he said softly. Wei nodded. "Would you like to see it before the ceremony? The piano where I first learned to play?" Thompson's eyes brightened. "I'd love nothing more." Wei led Thompson away from the crowd, his grandfather following closely behind. They walked to a small house at the edge of the village, indistinguishable from its neighbors except for the carefully tended flowers by the door, his mother's pride and joy. Inside, the house was simple but meticulously clean. Photographs covered one wall. Wei at various performances, Wei with his classmates at Juilliard, Wei and Thompson at Carnegie Hall after Wei's debut there the previous year. But prominently displayed in the center was a faded photograph of the old upright piano with Wei's grandfather standing beside it. And there in the corner of the main room stood the piano itself, the original one, weathered and worn, with its slightly yellowed keys and scuffed wood. "We donated it to the community center when the new pianos arrived," Wei explained, "but my grandfather insisted on bringing it back home for today. He thought you should see it." Thompson approached the old piano with reverence. He ran his fingers lightly over its surface, noting the scratches and worn spots that told of decades of use. He pressed one key, then another, listening to the slightly out of tune but still warm sound. "May I?" he asked, gesturing to the bench. Wei's grandfather nodded eagerly, speaking rapidly in Mandarin, which Wei translated. "He says he has waited many years to hear the great American teacher play on our humble piano." Thompson sat down at the instrument that had started Wei on his journey. He adjusted the bench, placed his hands on the keys, and began to play. Not a technical showpiece or a complex classical work, but a simple, heartfelt rendition of a Chinese folk song that Wei had once played for him during a lesson. Wei's grandfather's eyes filled with tears. Though the piano was imperfect, some keys sticking slightly, the pedals creaking, in Thompson's hands it sang with dignity and beauty. When he finished, Thompson turned to Wei. "I understand now," he said quietly. "What do you understand?" we asked. "Why you play the way you do?" Thompson's gaze moved from Wei to the old piano to the photographs on the wall. "When I first heard you, I couldn't reconcile your playing with what I knew about your training. It didn't make sense to me that someone with so little formal instruction could play with such truth." He stood from the bench, moving to stand beside Wei's grandfather. "But it wasn't despite your background that you played that way. It was because of it." He gestured around the modest room. "Here, music was never about competitions or careers or impressing anyone. It was simply about love." Wei translated for his grandfather, whose weathered face broke into a wide smile. The old man responded with a stream of Mandarin, gesturing expressively. "He says," Wei translated, his voice thick with emotion, "that the day I first showed interest in the piano was the happiest of his life, and that when he sent me to America, he was afraid he might lose me to that big world. But instead, that world brought part of me back home to help other children." They stood together in comfortable silence until a villager appeared at the door, informing them that the crowd was waiting for the ceremony to begin. As they walked back toward the community center, Thompson put his arm around Wei's shoulders. "You know," he said, "I've been teaching for over 35 years now. Hundreds of students have passed through my studio, many of them incredibly gifted." Wei nodded, waiting. "But in all that time," Thompson continued, "only one student truly changed me as a teacher and as a person." He stopped walking, turning to face Wei directly. "That competition 5 years ago, it wasn't just a turning point in your life. It was a turning point in mine as well." Wei looked puzzled. "But you were already famous, already at the top of your field." Thompson shook his head. "I was successful, yes. Respected, certainly. But I had become rigid in my thinking, narrow in my vision of what music could be and who could create it." He gestured toward the community center where dozens of village children waited, many of whom would benefit from the scholarship program. "You reminded me that talent doesn't only flourish in prestigious conservatories. That true musicianship comes from the heart first, the hands second. They resumed walking, now approaching the crowd that had gathered for the ceremony. Cameras flashed. Children pointed excitedly at Wei and whispered to each other. Parents looked on with hope that perhaps their child might be the next to find a path through music. On a small stage set up for the occasion, scissors and a red ribbon had been arranged for the ceremonial opening. Beside them stood a beautiful new grand piano, a donation from one of the foundations supporting the program. As Wei and Thompson took their places on the stage, a hush fell over the crowd. Wei stepped to the microphone first, speaking in Mandarin to his fellow villagers, thanking them for their support, explaining how this program would work. Then Thompson spoke, with Wei translating his words. He told the story of their first meeting, not shying away from his initial dismissiveness. He spoke of the lesson he had learned about looking beyond appearances, beyond backgrounds, beyond credentials. He spoke about finding greatness in unexpected places. When the speeches were done and the ribbon cut, Wei sat at the new grand piano. The instrument gleamed in the sunlight, a stark contrast to the humble surroundings of the village square. He looked out at the faces watching him, his grandfather, his neighbors, the children who would now have opportunities he had only dreamed of, and Dr. Thompson, the teacher who had once looked down on him and now looked at him with profound respect and affection. Wei placed his hands on the keys and began to play. Not Chopin this time, but a piece he had composed himself, one that spoke of his journey from this small village to the great concert halls of the world and back again. And as the music filled the air, touching something deep in everyone who listened, the story that had begun 5 years ago with an American instructor looking down on a young piano player came full circle. A reminder that sometimes the greatest talents are found in the most unexpected places, and that true music, like true understanding, knows no borders.